No leader wants to be the person in charge when all hell breaks loose. Or do they? The pandemic keeps Toronto from reopening. Anti-black racism demonstrations call for real change in how policing, among many other things, takes place in the city. And the city's books, well, that's billions and billions in big trouble. John Tory is the 65th mayor of Toronto, and he joins us now from what we still call 55 years after its inception, New City Hall. Your worship, how you doing today?
Well, I think I should be hiding under my desk after that introduction. But having said that, we come to work each day taking on the challenges that you mentioned and many more, and doing that as best we can. And I think we've come through the pandemic so far quite well as a city, certainly in a caring and compassionate way. But on we go.
Well, indeed, we will talk about all those things. And let's just start with the numbers at hand. These are the most recent figures we have. Almost 13,000 cases in the city of Toronto for COVID-19, more than 10,000 recovered, but still nearly 1,000 deaths. And presumably some of that contributed to your announcing today that on the 2nd of July, you would like to see in place a new policy which requires almost everybody, I guess little kids under the age of 2 and some other special cases, but almost everybody to have a mandatory mask wearing policy on public transit. What's the thinking there?
Well, the thinking is very simple. The best way, as we know, to stop the spread of the virus is through physical distancing. But there will come a time, and it's not that far away, when we hope a lot of people will be back on public transit, and it won't be possible to guarantee that 2 meters, that's 6 feet between people on the public transit. And as a result, we move to the next piece of medical advice we've consistently received, which is when that's not possible, wear a mask. And so in this case, we felt in the best interest of public health and protecting all the passengers and staff on the TTC that it was best to make that mandatory. And so effective July 2nd, subject to some exceptions, as you said, people with certain kinds of health issues, that's what will be done.
Do you intend to have the TTC provide this equipment if people don't have it themselves?
No, what will be done is there will be an initial allocation of 1 million masks that will be distributed. But what we're hopeful of, and this is in order to address the question of accessibility to people with lower incomes and so on, is that people will understand the options that are presented. There's very clear graphics set out in a lot of the communications, include a face covering which could consist of a scarf that people have that they might have in their ordinary clothing, and that if you wear it in a certain way, it provides the same protection to others. Because let's remember, when you wear a face covering, it's really not to protect yourself as much as it is to protect others from your water droplets that are coming from your mouth. So we're very optimistic between that and probably a partnership that will arise to sell these masks, as has been done in other cities by say a nonprofit organization like the United Way or somebody, that will find ways to make sure these masks are accessible to and worn by the vast majority, which we've seen in other cities. There's very high compliance with this.
If people decline to wear a mask, and this is the new policy, will they be turned away from using the system?
No, no person will be guaranteed a ride on the TTC on the basis of not wearing a mask. There are exceptions where people are entitled to, but that's just really the point, isn't it, about enforcement? Are you going to start having arguments with people about whether they have COPD or whether the child's really 2 because the child looks awfully big? We're not. And so we're going to rely on people, as we do in so many areas of life, to say, look, take the public good into account. Be considerate of your fellow passengers. Be considerate of yourself and your own health, and wear a face covering. And I think even from what I saw riding on the TTC this morning, the majority are already doing it before it was made mandatory. So I think there'll be high compliance with this. And we've seen that in places like New York, where you're up in the 90s in terms of people who do it and follow a mandatory order without enforcement taking place.
Okay, let's move on to the reopening of the city, which at the appropriate time I'm sure you'd like to see. The Premier of Ontario, of course, famously announced earlier this week that much of the province would start to reopen into stage 2, but not the capital city. And I wonder if you think that says something about either how well or not the city has done getting this virus under control.
Well, let me start off by saying, when you showed that number at 956 deaths, that's a tragic and unacceptable number. But I will tell you, when we came into the very beginnings of the pandemic, right way back in March, I asked for a meeting and a presentation on what they thought the projections were for the city of Toronto. And it was maybe one of the scariest moments of my life when the medical officer of health projected a minimum number of deaths in the city at 4,000. I couldn't even contemplate a circumstance in which, in any city in Canada, leave alone the city of Toronto, that you would lose 4,000 people or more. And that's why we took the steps we did and advocated the steps to the province that we did, because we in fact moved on some of these areas before they did, to really shut the city down. But when you're dealing with a big city here, and this has been true in big cities around the world, you are dealing with a denser population, you are dealing with higher higher concentrations of people who live in apartments in larger numbers, in smaller apartments, and this kind of thing. And so I think we've done really well. I mean, notwithstanding that I'm not trying to minimize for a second the 956 deaths or the thousands of people who've got the virus. And I think what the Premier has done, and I thank him for it, is to be sensitive to the fact that all of the municipalities, by the way, in the GTA, not just Toronto, have had a higher concentration because you've got denser populations and an easier time to spread, as opposed to areas where the population is more sparse or more widely spread out. All have said that they're not necessarily in a position to reopen as fast as the rest of the province. And we urged upon him, acting in concert, because I convene meetings of those mayors, that he should do exactly what he's done. And I thank him for that. I think it's sensible. And now our task is to move Toronto and the GTA to a position of being able to reopen as soon as possible.
The financial consequences to the city have been nothing short of cataclysmic, and I just want to go through some of the numbers to share with our viewers and listeners and then have you comment on that. The financial toll on the city looks like this: $1.5 billion budget shortfall. 19,000 city employees would have to be let go. This is, again, if the city doesn't get some kind of relief here. The TTC would have to reduce service by more than $500 million. The service on lines 1 and 2 would be cut in half. The Scarborough Rapid Transit, the Shepherd Line, would be shut down entirely. Wheel-Trans, which of course offers rides to those who have physical challenges, would have to eliminate 4 million rides. A $30 million plus budget cut for the Toronto Police. Might be some people who wouldn't be too upset with that, but that's 500 frontline police officers cut. $23 million loss for the Toronto Fire Service. Shelter space cut in half, and nearly a $500 million decrease in capital infrastructure spending. I guess I've got to ask, in a city that's almost 2 centuries old, do you think this is the greatest challenge this city has ever faced?
Without question. And again, I haven't been around for that whole time, obviously, but I don't think there's ever been a challenge that's been, put in front of the city like this that has so many different fronts to it, economic, health, the financial consequences for the city and for people. So that's why we're dealing with it as best we can. But it's also the case that when you have a challenge of that magnitude, that historic, unprecedented proportion, you need the support of the other governments. And those cuts that you talked about would be cuts we would have to make, or in the alternative, literally a 40% increase in property taxes. And by the way, for the viewers that are watching this across Ontario, the numbers for Toronto are particularly horrific. But this affects every municipality in the province. They've all fallen short on their revenues for one reason or another. In our case, we have the third largest transit system in North America here. We move more people on a daily basis, 1.8 million, than any city except Mexico City and New York. And so when we lose the passengers because they're either not working or they don't want to go on transit, and that costs us $21 million per week, that's how those numbers add up. And that is why I think it is fair when you're dealing here, not with mismanagement. The city of Toronto was, I think, one of the best managed cities financially in North America before this happened, and a city that was the fastest growing in North America, a study just out to say that. It was booming, and it was well managed. But a pandemic caused us to lose all this money, and now we're saying to the other governments, which have sources of revenue we don't, we basically have the property tax, and they have the ability to borrow money, which we don't, and I support that we need help from them. And so far, they've been doing a bit of a constitutional two-step with one another about helping. They both said they will help. The time for expressions of good intent is over. The time for them deciding on some way in which they're going to jointly help us is here. And otherwise, the consequences are what you just said out a couple of minutes ago. And it would be catastrophic for a city that should be leading the recovery in Ontario and in Canada. We represent 20% of the country's entire economy. And so we got to lead in that recovery. And I'm pleased to take every step to do so, but we need help.
That constitutional two-step, though, is, that's no small affair. Obviously, Prime Minister Trudeau is telling Premier Ford, cities are your responsibility. And Premier Ford tells the Prime Minister, yeah, but I haven't got a money printing press in the basement at Queen's Park. And that leaves you waiting. When do you think the waiting's going to end?
Well, I'm optimistic they are talking, but at the end of the day, this business of who has a printing press and who has constitutional responsibility is very interesting. I studied law and studied history, and it's all true. All of what they say about each other is true. Unfortunately, it doesn't buy us a lot of childcare or a lot of public transit or any of those kinds of things. So the point I would make to both of them, and I say this respectfully, is if they want Toronto, as it, I believe, can do, to lead in the recovery for the entire country, and to get people back to work here and get business going again and get people doing well personally and get them earning an income again, then the best thing they could do is help Toronto, but also all of the other municipalities, because, you know, towns big and small, we're the ones that are relied upon, and people know this from during the pandemic, to actually supply the emergency childcare or care for the homeless or make sure transit keeps going or make sure, you know, all the different things that have happened. And so that's true in every city and town. This is not a Toronto problem, because many times, as you well know, in our province and in our country, when you have a Toronto problem, people go, well, that's, you know, typical and whatever, and they don't have much interest in it. This is a problem faced by every city and town in this province. And so I think the sooner that they put aside all of the niceties of who's responsible for what and who has printing presses and who doesn't, and just decide they're going to do what's smart. And by the way, Steve, one final point on this: when those cities and towns across the province do well, none of the financial benefit of that return to them, because when people are paying income tax because they're working, when businesses are paying tax again because they're open and making a profit, and when people are buying things and thus paying HST, all of that money goes to the provincial and federal government. So when we recover, the financial beneficiaries, including recoveries in cities and towns, will be the province of Ontario and the government of Canada. And I'm fine with that. Well, I'm not really. Over the long term, they should fix that too. But at the end of the day, they will get their money back, more so than we would.
Okay, let's spend some time talking about something. You know, it's hard to imagine in the midst of a global pandemic where people are dying all the time that anything could throw that story off the front pages of the paper. But it's happened over the last couple of weeks. We are at a fundamental moment in history where anti-Black racism has finally captured everybody's attention. And you did say not too long ago, the message has been heard loud and clear. So I want to discuss that with you. If the message has been heard loud and clear, what does that mean in terms of concrete policy changes in this capital city going forward?
Well, I actually heard it loud and clear long before now, and that's why we established the first city in North America to do so, a Confronting Anti-Black Racism unit inside the city, which is confronting the existence of anti-Black racism, which I acknowledged as the first step in addressing the question years ago, is addressing areas of employment, areas of policing, areas of kind of cultural systemic racism that does exist in Ontario as it exists elsewhere. And so we've begun now to implement policies, whether it's in the collection of race-based data by police, for example, which had been resisted or not done for many, many years, whether it is in the creation of a Black staff network and compulsory mandatory training, which I myself will take next week as part of that, on anti-Black racism inside the city of Toronto, and we are moving to do the same thing for the police service. So there are a number of things we're doing, and I met with the Confronting Anti-Black Racism unit this week to say, all right, how can we take all the initiatives we've started on in various of these different areas and speed them up? But for us, this is really more of a sort of crescendo of people saying, you know, we want to support you to speed things up and to do more to wipe this out, as it is a revelation to us at the city. And that's because, you know, we are the most diverse city in the world. That's a fact. What we're striving to become, and that's why these efforts were important back starting when they were introduced, we want to become the most inclusive city in the world and wipe out racism. When I sat in the meetings that led to that action plan, Steve, and I heard people, when I heard our police chief, let alone the people I heard average citizens talk about going into a store when you're Black and being followed around the store within a minute of being in the store, when I heard our police chief, Mark Saunders, who is himself Black, as many people will know, talk about he walking into a store and within a minute, ironically, you sort of smile when you think about the whole concept of people not knowing he's the police chief and following him around. Not that it should make a difference. He was Black and they started following him around. And then he had to identify himself. And of course, everybody sort of somehow, you know, start to mumble and whatnot. But that's the proof of the fact that we have this challenge in front of us. So we're acting on it, and this will only heighten our sense of an imperative to act and speed it up, I hope.
I'm sure you've talked to protesters, though, who believe that Toronto is a city, quote unquote, built on white supremacy. What's your view of that?
Well, I think what we've had over time is it goes back to the days when the city was dominated by a population that was white, if I'll call it that. You know, but I think there's a number of other different attributes that people have brought to Toronto in this magnificent burst of diversity, where whether it's faith or whether it's skin color or whether it's sexual orientation, you know, things are different than they were 50 years ago. And I think what's happened is the leadership ranks and some of the approaches and the way we do things have not caught up. I was speaking on a webinar earlier this morning that Civic Action had put on, and I said, look, you know, business, for example, really has to up its game when it comes to reaching out to the population as a whole and make sure that people who are Black or brown or in other diverse and racialized groups are adequately represented in the ranks of employment in the city, because it just hasn't happened. And you know, people can debate whether it's happened because of conscious decision not to make it happen, or whether it's happened just because the system excludes people by having obstacles put in their way that make it more difficult for them to access jobs, say in tech. But the bottom line is we are where we are. And Black and brown and people of different diverse groups are underrepresented in many different ranks, including, by the way, on our own city council, where that's as a result of a democratic election process. But we've got to do better at these kinds of things. And we've certainly got to take out all the systemic barriers and obstacles, and in some cases, provide some additional supports which will make it possible for these people to pursue these opportunities. So I would say yes. I mean, the city, you know, continues to be underrepresented when it comes to, in various of its ranks, business and employment, the professions, the judiciary, the political establishment, underrepresented when it comes to the people who in fact make up the population of the city. And that's part of what we have to address in this whole series of issues we're going to confront going forward.
I know you know well the writer and activist Desmond Cole. He says, and this again is a quote from him that I'll get you to react to. He says that you brag about anti-racism while having cops on our transit system, cops in Toronto community housing. The city is ramping up its policing against our communities, and it's under Mayor Tory's watch. What's your view of that?
Well, look, you know, you can't win in some respects. I mean, people who lived in Toronto community housing, the very residents who live in there, many of whom are from racialized communities, asked us, pleaded with us, begged us to have more security in their buildings to protect them from an element of people who were, you know, dealing drugs and performing criminal acts. And so we responded to that. We had a massive problem on the TTC with fare evasion. And fare evasion, many of the people pleaded with us who were passengers of the TTC who were paying, who said it was unfair for other people not to pay. And so you respond in these areas by doing what you have to do in order to have, you know, the rule of law prevail. I think, do we have to, you know, step up our game when it comes to the practices and how the law is enforced, and make sure it is done with a degree of greater sensitivity to people who are from racialized communities or others suffering, say, from mental health? Yes, we do. And I take that on, and we have taken it on. There have been many changes and reforms, more so than Mr. Cole will ever give credit for, in the police service and the way it does its job. Have we yet met the required standard that would be expected of us as Torontonians or Canadians? No, we haven't. And so that's why I think the current attention to these issues is going to cause us to move faster and do more to make sure that policing is carried out in a manner that is more sensitive to, and that is less burdensome to any particular group. And that's why, for example, we moved, and Mr. Cole will never give credit for anything that has been done that's positive, but we moved for the first time under many, many different mayors. The collection of race-based statistics by the police was not done. In fact, it was consciously declined. It moved forward under my leadership with my full support and encouragement. And that will allow us to determine, based on facts, you know, what is happening vis-a-vis various demographic groups in Toronto. As well we should. And we're going to move to do the same thing. We're doing it with COVID-19. We are actually looking at the data, which the provinces declined to do, on the basis of who is being infected with this virus and where do they live and what are some of their circumstances, so that we can be sensitive to things that we might do to stop this kind of thing from happening. So I will just say I'm very much conscious of this. Mr. Cole has been a vociferous critic on many fronts of mine, and that's fair enough. That's a democracy, and God bless him. But at the end of the day, I think we're making more progress than he would ever want to concede.
You did reference Chief Mark Saunders a second ago, and I do want to follow up on him because he really surprised a lot of people the other day when announcing that he was going to retire from the police service several months before his contract actually expired. And I wonder whether you regret his decision to depart early, particularly at this moment where presumably, for many people, a Black police chief dealing with anti-Black racism issues might be just what the doctor ordered at this moment. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I will just say to you that I said to him when he came to see me to tell me, I was the first person he told, I guess beyond his family, which was a factor in all of this. He came to tell me that, and I said, well, you know, it's interesting because your last 12 months have been your best. And sometimes these jobs are incredibly stressful. They're incredibly complex, whether it's his job, my job, and look, we all volunteer for them, so I'm not asking anybody to feel sorry for us, but his job's incredibly complex and stressful. And I think he, you know, learned on the job, as we all do. But you can never pick the time when people leave. There's never a good time for a mayor or a police chief or, you know, other people to leave jobs, a CEO of a company. So he's leaving now, and that's the reality we have to deal with. And I hope what we can do is learn from some of the things that he's experienced and some of the things he's done, and move forward in this period of time between him and the selection of a new chief to to advance the process of change in policing, to really take a hard look at some of the questions that exist in policing, which deal with questions of race and mental health and others, and then to have a new chief presented with the opportunity, and we will pick carefully to make sure it's someone who's up to dealing with the issues that are in front of us today, a new chief ready to go and ready to do the job that is required of him or her in the 21st century.
Optics and symbolism, though, are crucial at the best of times, and these aren't the best of times. These are extraordinarily difficult times. Do you think the city of Toronto, given all the race issues that we are dealing with right now in this community, could pick a white male police chief at this moment in its history?
You know, what I will say is that I think that people in every part of the community, including people in racialized communities, people who are Black or brown or Muslim or Jewish or Protestant or any of the other things, they, I believe, in the vast, vast majority number, Steve, would say pick the person who's best for the job. Pick the person that is going to be best able to deal with issues of systemic discrimination and best able to deal with the challenges of dealing with people in crisis, which the police have to deal with. 32,000 of them last year in Toronto, 32,000 calls for people in crisis. They will say to us, we can't have it both ways, and say that we need to address these problems, and then say, but we're not going to pick the very best person for the job. So I'm not even going to begin to speculate on what that person will look like, what their gender is, what their age is, what their sexual orientation is, or any of those 1,000 characteristics, what languages they speak. I'm going to say that as one member of the police board and as mayor, I'll be saying we're going to pick the best person for the job. We will look everywhere we have to look to find that person. And that I think for us to say up front that the person has to be this or has to be that would be a huge mistake for us in terms of looking at the broadest selection of people we can to find someone who's up to dealing in substance with these issues and making the changes we must make.
Okay, fair enough. I wonder if you could weigh in on this, though. The largest item in your budget at Toronto City Hall is police services. It's north of $1 billion. And you have no doubt heard the cries for defunding the police, which have come up over the last couple of weeks in particular. And I wonder whether you are open to the notion of championing taking some money, I don't know how much, you guys will figure it out, of taking some money away from law enforcement that might otherwise be better spent on mental health respondents, domestic violence respondents, other kinds of things.
Well, first of all, you're suggesting it's an either or situation, and I know we're short of money, but I don't think we should be looking at either or in the sense of having a proper police service that's required to keep Toronto safe and at the same time making sure we can well look after people with mental illness. Is there a need, for example, to have more of these teams that consist of healthcare professionals to look after people who are mentally ill, including those that get involved in these calls the police get for people in crisis? Yes, there is. Should that be done then at the expense of the rest of policing in Toronto? I don't know. You see, again, I mean, viewers will agree or disagree with me on this, but my job, I believe, as a police board member and as mayor, is to make sure that what we do is supply the resources needed to both deal with issues of mental health, for example, and keep the city safe. And so I have shown the need for restraint in police budgeting through my time as mayor, having the first 2 years ever in a row in the history of the city where the police budget increase was zero. The average increase over my time as mayor has been 1.6% per year, less than inflation. The number of police officers, and some are critical of this, has gone down during the time I have been mayor. And the portion of the budget, while you're right, it's still the largest number, taken up by the police budget has dropped compared to my two predecessors. So are we open to having a discussion now about how we might look at allocation of money or the functions the police service performs in our city? Yes, we are, very much so. And I'm leading in that process, and we'll be taking some leadership steps in that in the coming days. But do I believe that the way to go about this is somebody just picking a number and saying, let's cut 10% off the police budget? What are we going to cut first? Would it be the community policing, or would it maybe be the new group we just put in place to deal with careless drivers, which was demanded by the public in the interest of pedestrian safety? Or, what would it be? And so this, to me, is not the way to go about this. This is not what people want. They want to see reform. They want to see change. They want to see more sensitive policing, sensitive to the population we serve and sensitive to certain issues like mental health and racism. But I don't think they want to see some, kind of ad hoc cut just on a number that came about in somebody's head. They want to see us do this thoughtfully and carefully. I will lead in that process. It will be done. I think I've shown my bona fides in having a growth in the police budget that has been very modest compared to my predecessors, and we will continue to do whatever we can to be responsible and to make policing done in a way that is safe and effective and sensitive to the issues that are in front of us now and have been for some time.
Mayor Tory, what about body cameras? Would you like to see every officer outfitted with one?
I've been supportive of this for a long time, and in fact, the police board approved the acquisition of body cameras. And as you, I think, understand, you can't win sometimes in this business. Years ago, from various things that happened at City Hall, not on my watch, we put in place rigorous procurement requirements that made you go through a competitive process, and quite properly so. So that process is now at its end. We're in a position where I asked, and I've got the concurrence of the board chair to have the final approval of the actual vendor of these cameras brought to the board. I hope it'll be approved in July. And the chief has assured me he can have cameras onto some of the officers by the early fall and on every officer by the end of the year. So I think that'll be a major step forward. And again, something that's happening on my watch with my enthusiastic support, as it has been for some time.
Okay. We're down to our last minute, unfortunately, because this is a bit of a tricky question. But just in the last few days, there's been a good debate started in the capital city about whether some of the street names, for example, that are named after people that, let's face it, were not particularly racially sensitive when they came here, or even in some cases never came here 2.5 centuries ago. Dundas, for example, or Jarvis. Should we change these street names?
Well, what I didn't even know there was a Mr. Dundas or a Mr. Jarvis. Like, I've lived in the city my whole life, and you don't necessarily know these things. And now I find out who these people are and what their track record seems to have been. So again, I go about these things in a way that I think is the way the public would expect, which is that I've asked our city manager to put a group together, including representation from our anti-Black racism unit and our Indigenous Affairs office, to sit down and discuss a way in which you can do this with some public consultation and some input, but also being very sensitive to some of this history that even for me was a revelation. Like, I don't know who these people are. I didn't know where any of these names came from to speak of. And so we will do that, and it will lead to a result and a recommendation, which I'm quite happy to follow. But I think, by and large, what they've done in some other places, which they found to be a way that addresses some of the practicalities of this, is educated people and put up literally, posters and things like that explaining the history. And they have ended up in some cases not changing the name. But I'm not going to prejudge that. That's what I asked the city manager to give us advice on. If he says and his advisors that we should change these names and find a way to go about doing it, then that's what we'll do. If they say we should do something else or consider a range of options, then I'm relying on him to come forward with objective, thoughtful advice and a thoughtful, objective process to deal with this so that we can do it in a sensible manner, but be sensitive to the fact these things are hurtful to some people, different groups out there that, were perhaps, or their predecessors, their ancestors were hurt at the hands of some of these very same people who have their names or statutes around the city.
Your Worship, we're always grateful when you spend so much time with us on TVO. Be safe out there, and thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Steve, always.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.